You're with Cape Talk. This is Refilwe Moloto on Breakfast.
All right, I am joined in studio this morning by Jacqueline Hoorn, who is the Western Cape Area Manager for NICRO. Welcome to Breakfast with Refilwe.
Good morning, Refilwe, and thank you for having us.
Of course. And of course on the line we have Professor Lucas Munting. He is the project head of Africa Criminal Justice Reform at the Dullah Omar Institute at UWC. Good morning, Prof. Welcome to Breakfast.
Good morning.
All right, we are at a little bit of a crossroads now in South Africa. It probably has been happening for some time, but two very high-profile cases brought to our attention. Most recently, 8-year-old Regan Gertze of Tulbagh, killed allegedly by a suspect released recently on parole. And of course, little Tasnie van Wyk's suspected murderer, Muideen Pangaka, also revealed to have absconded from parole a year ago. He had been granted parole after having served half of a 10-year sentence for crimes including kidnapping and culpable homicide. And as I mentioned, Justice Minister Ronald Lamola has now summoned the Correctional Services Department and secretaries of parole boards to address what he calls the flaws of the parole system. Prof, perhaps from an academic perspective and a criminal justice reform perspective, what would you say maybe were the flaws that led us to this situation?
Well, I think there's a broader picture, but also a narrower vision on the problem. I think on the broader level, we've got to start from the assumption that our criminal justice system is failing, if not on the edge of collapse. So there are a lot of people who should be prosecuted that aren't prosecuted. And I think we need to acknowledge that right from the start. And that also informs our expectations of the criminal justice system in terms of having an impact on crime. The sort of more narrower focus is in these recent cases, they were released by parole boards. And parole boards base their decisions on information that is supplied to them by the Department of Correctional Services through a structure known as the Case Management Committee. If the parole board receives a fairly complete file with detailed information and clear recommendations, I'm fairly sure any parole board would apply its mind and go with what is placed before them, but also critically examine it and so forth. But if the file is incomplete or it's not very well filled out and so on, then the decision ultimately will be compromised. And my guess is that is where the problem is at the moment, is the quality of information that is placed before the parole boards and the ability of parole boards to utilize that information with a view to make society a safer place.
Jacqueline, would you agree? I mean, for me, I would imagine the first piece of information that I need as a parole board is the parolee's reason for being here. We're talking about people who've seen violent or very concerning crimes. If I understand it, Muideen Pangaka had been arrested or convicted 11 times since the 80s.
Like Prof was saying, that when a case is presented at the parole board, there's multiple reports from your social workers, from your psychologists, even the education, the different departments that's within DCS that is being looked at. So you look at qualified people that presents a report, and then when it is presented at the board, the parole board, then that will be their cue to make their decisions. What needs to maybe be more emphasized is the representative from the community, because you've got the professional opinion that has been working with the person that's been in conflict with the law, throughout his period or her period in prison, but you don't necessarily have the view or the community's voice, also to have a balance.
So NICRO, for whom you are the Western Cape head, NICRO concerns itself with restorative justice. But I think Professor Munting has made a very interesting point about the criminal justice system at large, the fact that it is fractured in general. We speak often about how you could call our prisons criminal university. Right? Once people go in, they ultimately are going to either learn to get better at what they did to get them in there, or they're going to get even more hardened. In that environment, should there even be parole? Should we even consider parole if people are simply going in and getting more and more hardened? Because we're seeing repeat offenders here.
Social work, NICRO has mostly social workers and registered counsellors. And our approach is we look at person-centred and like holistic view of a person and also strength-based. We also view that prison, being incarcerated, should not be the ultimate or the only response to when wanting to address the root causes.
Sure.
You understand? So our opinion, and also just to add on what Prof was saying, there are a lot of interdepartmental gaps, and we are in the view that collaboration should take place. The Department of Criminal Justice, our NPA, SAPS, DCS, COMCO, all the departments, has a very critical role to play when a person is sentenced or sent to prison. One of the cases, Regan's case, it was postponed yesterday because of the community that has been, in uproar about, the unveiling of this case and so forth. But then when is this case going to be finalized? Because the finalization of a matter can then either the sooner a case is finalized, the sooner reintegration and restorative justice can take place.
I hear you. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit after the break. We've got to go to traffic about, in the meantime, right? So we've got these broken systems and broken departments that don't talk to one another. In the meantime, 7 and 8-year-olds are dying. So I'd like to know how we should approach. Maybe it is a moratorium on parole until we fix the systems, because communities can't take much more. With the recent headlines that we've seen and the concerns, particularly as they affect our most vulnerable with children, increasingly I'm hearing from you at home a call for us not to reintegrate offenders, a call for people to go to jail permanently. Now, I'm getting questions coming through here. What happened to life without parole? Someone else has asked here, with technology and tracking advancements, it provides an opportunity to relook the whole prison and punishment rehabilitation system. Prisons are not a good place and it costs way too much. Prisoners and parolees should be made to wear trackers so we always know where they are. There should also be a register of them, and you can have an app to let you know if they are close to you. What information do we have to be able to see where prisoners are? Professor, do you know?
Yeah. I mean, there's definitely been some technological advancements, and the department did acquire electronic tags, but unfortunately that contract was then implicated in corruption, and then the entire proposal or initiative came to an end because it would have cost more to tag somebody than to keep them in prison. I also want to pick up on the issue of life without parole and not releasing people. The overwhelming majority of people in prison will eventually be released sooner or later. Our law provides that when one is sentenced to life imprisonment, that is indeed life imprisonment. However, after serving at least 25 years, the person must be considered for parole. That is the only right there is. It does not mean you have to be released or anything in that direction. It merely says you have to be considered for parole. And then I think one needs to look carefully about or look carefully at the role of the parole board itself. The parole board is there to make a decision on the prospects for release of a particular individual based on that person's behavior whilst imprisoned. The parole board is not an extension of the court in the sense of repunishment. The parole board is there to say, ask the question, how did this person behave in prison, and what are their prospects when released? It's not about saying, well, you did such an awful crime 20 years ago, therefore we cannot release you. That's the court's job, and the court did that job 20 years ago. And I think we must be very mindful of how these functions play out in practice and how we sometimes merge our expectations regarding them.
That's understandable. So let's talk a little bit about their behavior within the prison, and then you said also their prospects for release. I'm happy to throw this to either of you. I know Nikra obviously works with the reintegration, but what would you say is the environment in South Africa in terms of absorbing former offenders? Because, you know, and the inability, for example, to get hired, or you know, or the difficulty with getting hired would be an immediate incentive for me to maybe reoffend in one way or another, at least economically. Okay, you go ahead.
Yeah, Refilwe, just in terms of the behavior and how it is tabled to the board, it's like I mentioned, within DCS they have their professionals, and there's a lot of activities that is happening within the prisons to help start the process of rehabilitation. So you do get individuals that is reformed because they take the opportunity whilst being incarcerated. We need to be mindful that being incarcerated is temporary. It's temporary. It's you come from a family, you come from a community, and at some point you have to return and go back once you have completed your sentence. Also, in terms of the overcrowdedness, there's a lot of, you know, other ills that then transpire while being incarcerated. So incarceration should not be seen as the only solution to this crisis that we are having. We, as NICRA, we say we have interventions, and a lot of other organizations as well in the communities. Support those communities, strengthen their resources, invest in that in terms of funding to help capacitate families, communities where these individuals are coming from.
Sure. And I'm guessing that is an intervention that should probably happen before sentencing, right? So, in other words, the option should be other than going in.
Yeah.
But
part of NICRA's work is also to do alternative to incarceration. So we work with the courts and we try to keep cases, petty cases, out of prison. And we are also focusing more on preventative interventions before it gets to this point where we are at now.
But now, with our focus on once I'm in, and whether or not I should leave. You know, you mentioned overcrowding, and it has been mentioned in the past when the president pardons people and the like. Overcrowding is a very, very poor or difficult, let me say, reason to give to a grieving mother. This person is here because they're renting out beds, and that's why your child is gone. You know, it's a hard one for us to deal with. So you can understand the rage. You can understand why these people go to those courts and are up in arms. And so, Prof, you know, I think you both actually are giving us a lot to think about in terms of this is not supposed to be, you know, what is it, prosecutor, judge, and you know, a final sort of playing God on these people's lives. But I still want to know, Prof, in the meantime, and I have posed this question to Jacqueline before the break, or earlier on, in the meantime, while the system is broken, how could we improve the parole system to prevent reoffending?
I think there are a few things we can do. But just as context, I want to say that the quality of information available from the Department of Correctional Services has deteriorated rapidly over the last 10 plus years. So the statistical information about who is in prison, what profile they have, etc., that is lacking, and that needs to be addressed. But apart from that, from an operations management perspective, I think the priority for the Department of Correctional Services at this stage should be to make sure they know where high-risk parolees are and that they have not absconded. And if they have absconded, they must be a priority for tracking down and bringing back into custody. And with high-risk individuals, I would refer to people who've been convicted of more than one offence, violent offence against children and young or women,
right.
Where there's a history of violent behaviour. And we know this from the research, is that the the best predictor for future behavior is past behavior.
Right.
And I think the cases that are getting profiled at the moment in the media, we see there is a history of violent behavior. It's not the first time. And I think correctional services need to take note of that.
Okay. And so just out of interest then, do we have halfway houses in South Africa, for example, for, let's say, the high-risk ones or places where they need to live? Because there are, about 30,000 parolees in the country?
30,000 parolees and a similar figure under correctional supervision. So we're talking roughly about 60,000 people. But halfway houses, I stand to be corrected, but there may be 2 or 3 of them, and they are for young people. But in terms of the effectiveness of halfway houses, the research tells us the jury is still out on that one. It has not yet proven itself to be successful.
And so can you just highlight the difference for us between a correctional supervision and parolee?
Parole is a release from imprisonment, and it's a decision made by the Department of Correctional Services. And you have to serve, as a rule of thumb, 1/2 of your sentence before you can be released. There are variations on that. Correctional supervision is a sentence imposed by the court and supervised by the Department of Correctional Services.
Something like those alternatives Jacqueline was talking about.
Yes. So, for example, when Oscar Pistorius was sentenced the first time, he was sentenced under Section 2761I of the Criminal Procedure Act that required that he must serve at least 1/6 of the sentence in prison and the rest under correctional supervision in the community. So that's the difference.
Like house arrest or...
Yeah.
So just as a final thought from each of you, please, what do you like to hear most from Justice Minister Ronald Lamola in his discussion with these guys on how to look at the parole boards going forward?
I think Refilwe for NICRO, it is to really make sure that the community's voices are heard when decisions are made. There are existing organizations from these communities that's already doing the work, but they are not being resourced or funded to do the work. If there's no funding, services automatically closes down, like the ankle bracelet. It's a good initiative, great to monitor. However, corruption, funding, those challenges comes in, and then services has to be terminated. And that is one of the biggest challenges I think civil society is facing, where there's people that's willing to do this difficult work, because this is a very challenging field to work in, but then there's no resources or funding to support the services.
And in 30 seconds to you, Professor Lucas Munteng, what would you say is the one thing you want to hear from Ronald Lamola?
I think we need to see evidence-based decision-making, that whenever a parole board or any other justice official for that matter makes a decision, it is based on good and solid evidence, and that they are able to account for that, and that their explanation will be predictable. It must not be a mystery how they have come to a particular conclusion.
All right. Thank you to both of you. Professor Lucas Munteng, Project Head of Africa Criminal Justice Reform at the Dalla Omar Institute at UWC. Thank you for joining us. And Jacqueline Hoorn, who is the Western Cape Area Manager at NICRO. Thank you so much for making the time to come to our Wednesday panel. The burning question for most of us, of course, is what in the world do we do about this criminal justice system in South Africa? To your WhatsApps, Heidi Fulo says, Sue in Tableview. Hi, Sue. She says, one hopes that the final step for the parole board in future, when considering whether or not to grant parole, will be to ask each member and record their individual responses, whether they'd grant it if the prisoner in question were to be released into their own neighbour's property. Now, that's an important point, Sue, which I think reflects what Jacqueline was trying to say about getting the community's input. So if this person were to be your neighbour, well, talk to people who are their neighbours and ask whether or not they should be exposed to this person again. Leiden is back up. Hi, sorry, we lost you there.
Yeah, sorry, I wasn't sure where I got cut off. But yeah, I think just to summarise, I think it's really about, as a community, how are we playing an active role? Are we a part of watch groups? Are we part of forums? Are we part of sort of the Ratepayers Association? And I mean, just last night I was reading through some AGMs from Ratepayers Association, and it seems to be a general seem that there isn't participation from communities.
Yeah.
And I'm sure these are the same people calling for harsher crimes, fed up with crime.
Right, showing up at the courts and up in arms. A very, very good point, actually, I think. Thank you very much, Leiden. Brett in Somerset West, thoughts on parole?
Morning, Refilwe. Just a thought that I had listening to your guests. One thing is, on a general basis, that there seems to be this freeze in government. We're scared to spend money on equipment because of the corruption that goes on in the spending process. So we don't go and buy things like the ankle bracelets because they're going to cost us 20 times what they should. And then the other thing is, the emphasis in the parole system should be on there must be a very good motivation for giving the person parole, not a very good motivation for not giving it.
I'm with you. Yes.
Almost defensive rather than taking responsibility.
I think I hear you. So we need to be able to say there's a shining light in the corner of that prison that I think needs to be free, as opposed to, okay, you're halfway through your sentence, now we get to talk to you.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, I hear you.
Just really a good reason to parole the person.
I'm with you. Thanks, Brett.
I mean, as citizens, we're already playing our part by paying the tax to keep them in prison for the time they're in prison.
Quite right. All right. Thanks a lot, Brett. Great suggestion, that. Hoping that Ronald Lamola is listening. Morning, Justice Minister. Why can prisoners not be used to build more prisons? Let prisoners work, farm, earn a living, asks this question. I seem to recall this used to be something that was done in the past. I'm not convinced that it's done anymore. I think it's probably got something to do with rights. Another WhatsApp here saying, I feel that most of our problems point to incompetence. SAA, ESCOM, government, criminal justice, incompetence. It's heartbreaking. I mean, that's quite right. Both of those solutions that were put forward, Lucas's solution that we have more evidence-based decision-making, and Jacqueline's, or maybe not so much Jacqueline's, but definitely, Jacqueline's, with respect to empowering the community by spending better on them. Both of them require this capable state that seems to be so elusive to us, that the record-keeping apparently is so poor within the Department of Correctional Services that we're getting poor records as a basis for releasing people. And as Brett says, there's this kind of, well, it's time, so you go, as opposed to seeing something motivated that says, for sure, this person needs to can leave prison and has motivated that they are deserving of leaving. Why not have the prisoners work while incarcerated, asks this WhatsApp. In America, prisoners make number plates and the like. Surely putting these people to work will mean they are covering some of the cost of their incarceration and teaching them a skill they can use outside prison. Keeping their idle hands busy can only be a benefit. I cannot go into the details of the 13th Amendment of the United States Constitution right now, but those guys working in that prison is an overhang of the end of slavery, and the railroads were built that way. But anyway, the point is they have private prisons. It's very different, and there's profit. So by the way, if you buy, for example, Victoria's Secret, it might have been made by a prisoner in the United States. And they also pay poorly, very, very poorly, like slave wages. With our terrible prison situation, should there not be some kind of other punishment available for perpetrators of non-violent crime? I'm suspecting that WhatsApp came in after Jacqueline mentioned the interventions that NICRO tries to undertake. But if you did miss it, do go to capetalk.co.za in a few minutes, and the conversation should be there. But yes, NICRO tends to try and encourage at the sentencing point in the court system, and this is also what Professor Lucas Munting was talking about in terms of correctional supervision. Those are both the alternatives that are used to prison in itself. Someone has a question or a voice note on medical parole. If we can have a listen to that, please, Mario.
How can you be discussing the merits of the parole system and parole board? Let's use an example like Shabir Sheikh. The parole system allowed him out because he was terminally ill. Where is he today? On the golf course.
That's precisely why we're discussing the parole board.